Welcome back, everyone. I am Cas Piancey. I'm joined, as usual, by my partner in crime, Mr. Bennett Tomlin. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you, Cas?
I'm good. We're joined by a special guest, investigative journalist Vincent Woo, based out of the Bay Area. How are you?
I'm great. Nice to finally be on the pod. I've tried for so long.
I think it's really fun to have you because we're talking about a topic that I am particularly always angry about, and you're here to at least a little bit defend, and I appreciate that. I don't usually even plug any of our guest stuff. I let them do the plugging for their own work. But Vincent recently did a documentary interview of a mayoral candidate in San Francisco, Honest Charlie, who is just, I guess, honest. I don't know what to call him.
He's the future of San Francisco politics is what I call him.
He's our future mayor.
He's the present of San Francisco politics.
Assuming he gets on the ballot.
Yeah, we're here to talk about a topic closer to my heart, which is effective altruism, which is quite unpopular, I'll say, nowadays in general, and effective accelerationism, which is far more popular and which I also am not a huge fan of. I actually think it would be great to start with you, Vincent, and let you kind of give me an idea for why I shouldn't have this feeling about EA or E-accelerationism.
I think your feelings about E-acc are probably totally justified. I sometimes describe myself as like the last centrist defender of EA. There's actually probably a ton of them. I don't know, but like I like to say it because I think what's striking to me is how deeply people have become negatively polarized against EA. Coming from my world, so one thing that I do is I attempt to convince people to donate money to like a 501c3, right? Like we work on social issues around the Bay Area, especially. So I'm often trying to get people to donate money to advance the cause of like building housing in the Bay Area. And I have to use all these tricks to engender like sympathy in the mind of a potential donor. And it's usually only after like a really long period of time, like a social campaign, effectively, that people feel strongly enough about like any individual cause to donate. And this is across the entire domain of philanthropy, right? Like this isn't just me. Like there are entire fleets of people whose job it is to like try to keep the spirit of the fight alive in the mind of a donor. We'll send you 100 emails. We'll call you over and over again. We'll get your friends to call you. Like we'll do whatever it takes. And it's like pulling teeth. You know what I mean? And I understand, right? Like it's not like I begrudge the people who aren't necessarily like, leaping at the opportunity to give us money. Like their skepticism may be well earned, but I do have some admiration for any social movement where the participants of that movement self-select to donating money to what they see as a worthy cause. Like in the case of EA, I mean, it's typically like malaria nets. That's like, to me, that's completely admirable.
Sometimes it's malaria nets. Come on now. I mean, plenty of other ridiculous ideas that they have that they think need to be defended and worked on constantly. I think AGI was a big one for them. And I also think that we've discussed EA a couple times. A big part of my issue with it is that it pushes back the idea that you're going to be giving, that you don't give today, you give tomorrow or the next day after your earning power has increased, you've accumulated wealth, right?
I understand. I think it builds more urgency for giving than the alternative. The default, you have to understand, like 90+% of people are giving nothing, like the idea, even the baby step of that you have some social obligation to give, to me is a step in the right direction. Like to me, it's like we have the whole team of philanthropy, of which EA is just a tiny part, right? And really the enemy is apathy, is the tendency of humans to ignore problems that don't affect them right now and leave like a future generation to deal with it. Like if we can get anyone on board, I'm generally positive on them unless they do something like absolutely horrible,
I'm certainly sympathetic to the idea that like trying to do good and trying to assess whether or not like what you're doing is good is a reasonable frame for people to take. And yeah, just flat out, I think that's a reasonable frame for people to take. I think both Cas and I end up having some frustrations. Cas already mentioned like the tendency for certain members of EA groups to choose not to get right or to choose to defer giving until some future point when they've hit some arbitrarily large number. Or those who tend to focus on like various existential risks to avoid having to deal with certain risks to humanity. And you even see this sometimes and this is getting really meta and way too deep into the rationalist weeds, but you'll see like in their conversations about how they want to present themselves in public, you'll see like yuds come out and say like, we can't talk about animal welfare, we can't talk about AGI, we need to focus on, and the specific example he gave was malaria nets in Africa. He's like, malaria nets in Africa is something that's understandable to people. And if we present effective altruism as focused on things like distributing malaria nets in Africa, rather than on dealing with the existential risk of artificial general intelligence, we'll be able to accumulate the influence and stuff that is important for the broader EA movement to deal with their like set of
that seems totally
risks.
Reasonable though, right? Like the idea that you would present the intro level version of your social movement to the public first. I don't know. I actually have no beef with that whatsoever. We do the same thing. You know what I mean? Like in housing policy, we have a lot of like really complicated in the weeds proposal. Like for instance, like we want to repeal Prop 13 in California ultimately, right? But that's not what I'm going to tell someone who's never heard of the movement before, because it freaks them the fuck out. Like, and understandably, right? Like I get that.
It would freak out older voters, but
absolutely, yeah.
But I will say that, and I understand that they're the people
older
voting.
Voters is just a way to say voters.
I understand. But I am saying that as time passes, I do think that, you know, listen, I'm in my 30s. I will say I am against Prop 13. I think there's a lot of people my age and older who are against Prop 13 already. So I don't think it actually is as controversial as you think to be like, I'm going to push for this idea that we just get rid of Prop 13. Like that isn't as extreme as I think you're making it sound. And this is the idea where I go, I don't like the idea that you're presenting an easy pill to swallow. You're like, oh, malaria nets. Everyone likes malaria nets. And then you're like, anyway, now we're going to this 16D chess situation where we need to plan for that, and that's super important right now.
Cas, I do think you should remember that perhaps your friends are not among the moneyed and powerful interests. Like the ones who have money to give to causes, or the ones who have the ability to create new policies or make changes like that.
That, and even if we frame this in the worst light, I still like personally, like from a consequentialist perspective, right? Like if we can trick people into giving more money to do good, like I understand this is dangerous, and I understand why you dislike it, and I agree completely, actually, that it can be abused, and that arguably has been abused by, like, you know, you could call them EA leadership. I definitely don't condone the behavior of the guys who want to buy the castle or whatever. I guess like the thing I'm defending, I guess, is the social principle sort of at the heart of it. Like in its original conception by like a few like Oxford professors who are like, hey, let's just think about how we can spend our money towards philanthropy the best, and also sort of make a framework around like why that's something you ought to do. That's the thing I like about EA. That's the thing I admire and respect. I agree that, you know, like I'm not a big fan of Yudkowsky's public communications. Like we have some common ground there. But I also don't fault him necessarily for like wanting, you know, to put your best foot forward when you're marketing a social campaign. Like I can't fault someone for that, you know?
Cas, you and I both kind of had this tension last time where I kept returning to Singer and Ord and like the philosophical roots of effective altruism and like the way it grew out of utilitarianism and stuff like that, and how it is possible to use those philosophies, to take those philosophies and live a good life in which you help other people and do a lot of valuable good things. And it would seem like that if there exists this philosophy that makes it possible to do that, that the philosophy itself is not like inherently going to lead to ill, which means there's some other factor, perhaps related to the types of people that are attracted to this, that leads to many of them doing this type of ill. Like effective altruism itself is kind of milquetoast, right? Try to do good where you can. When you have the capacity to do good, you should go and do some good. If you see someone drowning in a pond and it's only going to make you 10 minutes late for work, maybe you should try to save the person drowning in the pond. I think most of that is actually largely unobjectionable, even to people who are like somewhat poisoned against EA at this point. And like the bigger problem seems to be the fact that many of them noticed that while they were thinking about it, they realized that money is the big lever, and just kept focusing on the money part to make their lever bigger and bigger and bigger in the hopes of eventually doing some change. And the types of people who are attracted to money as a form of power are not generally the types who actually care about doing that much good.
I sort of agree. I think another way to talk about this debate is to try to identify what is it about EAs that like really bother me or people in general so much. I'm not an EA, I feel like I should say, but like, I think what's interesting about them is that, like you put it, in many ways, it's a completely milquetoast philosophy. And yet it seems to piss people off way more than it should. And I think the money thing is a big part of it. And I think this is like sort of downstream of the philosophy's roots as like a fundamentally consequentialist framework of thinking. Right? Like if you need money to do good, more money to do more good is better. In certain, like if you accept the framing like of consequentialism as like a philosophical, like valid moral framework, I think you are sort of forced to conclude that might be true. And it's sort of hard to argue against, but I think people hate it because not everyone's a consequentialist, and I think that's really at the root of what pisses people off about it.
Obviously, I think the people associated with it and what they've done under the guise of EA has been to blame for a lot of the bad traction here. What we're discussing here is not the fact that like EA has been tarnished by Sam Bankman-Fried. The idea is that Sam Bankman-Fried was attracted to EA and became an outspoken person for it for a reason. Like there's a reason that this happened. And I do think it has largely to do with this concept of two things. One, I mean, greed is good has been bred into America deeply since the 80s. But two, I think that if you can justify greed as good and you can play it out 32 steps in advance and oh, well, then I'm going to have $30 billion to spend on whatever I want. Then you've justified this, as opposed to when I think of what's best for giving, my framework is not how much can I give, it's where can I give locally that will do the most.
I would say that makes you pretty normal, actually. I think most people think that way. And I think that is a perfectly valid moral framework that feels intuitive to most people. Here's my defense of EA again, like in a different way. One thing that's striking about EA is that it's managed to radicalize like a bunch of tech people, basically, like people whom would otherwise never give, have managed to trick themselves into a greed is good justified world where they actually do end up giving.
But do they? Do they?
I don't think the numbers lie. Like they have given quite a fair amount. I would say it's not insignificant. Like they have, like EAs, I think, net have probably saved quite a lot of lives. And I don't think that's something that can be like dismissed so easily. You know what I mean? Like I think your criticisms are valid. I agree that the framework of consequentialism leaves open the door to especially canny bad actors who can sort of use the very sort of logical framework of consequentialism to create an opportunity for abuse. And I think that is a weakness of this system that the community that is the very nascent group we call EA will have to learn to reckon with. But I don't think that's actually so different than any other nascent social movement. Like we all have problems. A friend of mine recently said to me, like, there are so many shitty guys and there are so few positions of power. And we see this in like even progressive politics, like that people are actually really good at taking like a rhetorical framework for doing good and using it to justify their own bad behavior. I think EA is exceptional in that the demographic of people who are into EA are like exceptionally like sort of online, somewhat moneyed tech people. I think that more than any of the rest of it made it this really fertile ground for an SBF to appear sooner or later, but I think it's a demographic thing more than it really is like because of the philosophical underpinnings of the framework thing.
There was an interesting thing I thought of when you were mentioning that, though, about how it's like convince tech people to give. Because if you take Sam Bankman-Fried and some of his friends at their word, which you shouldn't do, but assuming you did do that, they claimed that like Sam Bankman-Fried claimed that he considered whether he should be a journalist or something like that to have his impact in the world. And it was only when he read Earn to Give, but he also claimed he never read a book. So
it's hard to
figure
say.
that out when you want. When he read Earn to Give, that he realized that he should go and get a job at Jane Street because then he'd be able to do so much good than if he was a journalist or something like that. And so in Sam Bankman-Fried's version of events, which probably isn't true again, he wasn't a tech person convinced to give. He was a person convinced to follow that path so that he could later give, right? He became that type of tech person so he could give. Yeah. He wasn't a tech person who was convinced to give.
Well, look, I don't think any of the three of us believe a word of what you just said. And
you can't see Sam Bankman-Fried as an investigative journalist.
I would love to watch that biopic. I don't think it's possible. I was just look from my own personal experience meeting EAs. They're all already tech people. I haven't met a single EA who is like, well, I better get into programming. Though that is a thing that they say you might ought to do. I've seen a guide from EAs to think about, look, if you're not very wealthy right now, it might not be a good idea for you to give very much. But if you're good at math, like you might want to consider one of these careers. I don't think that's horrible advice. I haven't met anyone who's followed it, just like personally. But maybe, there probably are a few out there. I don't think it's the worst thing necessarily. I don't think most people are going to be able to bootstrap themselves to like SBF level fraud. I think for most people, earning to give actually looks way more reasonable. Like try to get a corporate job and like don't worry so much about whether your job is creating moral good in the world. That's mostly how I think about that line of reasoning. Because I think it's going to be really hard for most people to find a professional pursuit that can keep them alive that also is like sort of unambiguously altruistic,
Now, anyone can learn to code, though, if they go to Lambda School, I hear.
That's true. Anyone. Everyone, actually. It's going to be $100 billion company. That's why all three of us have invested in Lambda School. I think Cas more than either.
Yeah, all of my Cas coin is now in Lambda School.
That's correct, yeah. So, that's your retirement fund, actually.
I was a big believer in Lambda for like 2.5 weeks before I researched it.
What about it made that's actually pretty cool if they convinced you with just the marketing,
When I learned how to program, I learned way more by studying on my own than by listening to my teachers. And so I was willing to swallow the premise that like this was a thing that could be learned outside of the traditional structures. And I thought the economics of it were intriguing in terms of incentives. This is before I learned about, how some of the ISAs were being repackaged and sold off, and the incentive alignment that was like the base of the entire concept didn't exist in the way it was described. But like at its basic level of this is a thing people can learn and this is a way we can teach it in a way that potentially makes a bit more financial sense for them was somewhat appealing.
There's ways it didn't have to be predatory.
I think we can even like connect this silly in-joke to like what we're talking about too, right? Like,
and also, sorry, just before you say it, to make this not an in-joke, people should go read Vincent's reporting about Lambda School, now Bloom Tech.
And listen to his Jason Calacanis This Week in Startups interview, because it's beautiful.
That was a great time.
Now it's good. Less of an in-joke and more of an out-joke.
All right, let me try, right? Like, so I would I think, Lambda School with regard to like the wider educational space is akin in some ways, I think, to like the EA leadership within the broader movement of like, let's think about our philanthropy before we just give. Like in so much as like Lambda School is just another boot camp. Like there are a bunch of them. Some of them are seemingly like decently effective. Some of them less so. It's really hard to actually say what the magic sauce is, but they were able to use like canny marketing, being really aggressive about proclaiming their good in order to like dupe a large number of people to the detriment of all. And that's what happened with SBF, right? that's not to say that like post-secondary education isn't necessarily worthless, or that like the framework that maybe like you're better off learning outside of the university system is just wrong. Like a lot of my detractors accused me of being a shill for universities or something, which, you know, far from it, right? But the danger, I think, is like, you know, they become sort of a toxic asset in the space. Like now when people think of boot camps, they are sort of polarized by like the news about Lambda School to an extent. And I think this is a shame, actually. Like I'm actually pro boot camp. I think they're great. But as a result of my own reporting, the industry has suffered a PR problem to some extent. Likewise, I think that's what happened with SPF and EA, right? Like I think in 5 to 10 years, we might have a version of EA where maybe they picked a different name, maybe it's different people, but largely the framework of like, hey, you should, you know, and again, like this is something that Christianity does too, right? Like you should devote like a certain percentage of your earnings to some causes ranked roughly by, you know, what we call like effectiveness, but really you can do whatever you want. I think that will come back. Like I think that will survive SBF, and I think that will be to our betterment. But I sort of acknowledge that we've got to live through this dip where these words are just like so colored by what's recently happened. And I'm okay with that too. You know, like what are you going to do?
The most, I think, forgiving way that I perceive EA, do you remember the Giving Pledge?
Yeah.
The Giving Pledge is this idea, right? That, oh, I'm going to give away everything before I die. Who's going to disagree with that promise, right? No one's going to say, oh, I think that's terrible. You shouldn't say that. I think the problem with these pledges and these things that rich people say is that they don't have to act on them when they're alive, largely. Like they don't actually give very much in a lot of them. I'm not saying everyone. This isn't some blanket statement or something. I'm just saying, like, you know, the powerful billionaires on the top are people that we think about and aren't, I in my humble opinion, don't give enough. And I think the idea is making them give now as opposed to give later. And that's the problem.
So I'd say, like, one, I think your criticism is fair. Two, I think people said that when the Giving Pledge came out. I think it wasn't like it was a unanimous, this is good. There were a lot of detractors then and now. And look, I think it's baby steps, right? Like EA is less that. It's like a little more, let's give some now, right? Like we're pushing it closer and closer to the present. I don't think you're ever going to be able to convince billionaires outside of straight up taxation to give the majority of their profits to social causes. And I don't hold out hope for that as a like salvation for our society. But in the meantime, if some of the ones that are on the fence can be peer pressured into giving a bit, I'm going to shut up and take my checks wherever I can get them. You know what I mean? Like from my perspective, like we're in a war. Every check I get now that lets me save a life, like I don't care, right? Like I'm waiting for the government to step in and dramatically increase cap gains and inheritance tax, and I'm going to advocate for that. But if I can convince any patron to give me any, like, because I think actually, frankly, a lot of people who are wealthy are sort of torn between the notion that like they ought to live a beautiful life and that other people can't. I actually think that moral dilemma is pretty common, and where I can exploit it, I will. You know, so I see it as less like I guess I don't care whether they're good or bad people. Ultimately, like the morality of like their internal, just like whatever they're feeling, like whether they should be truly motivated to give or not. Like, I guess what I'm saying is I'm a consequentialist too. Maybe that's why I sort of like EA, right? Like I'm trying to do something I think is good. I'm going to take every like opportunity to do it that I can do reasonably. And if this moral framework is convincing, you know, like people with unearned wealth to give it to me, like I'm going to shut up. I know where my bread is buttered, you know, like that's how I feel.
One thing you mentioned just a couple minutes ago was the idea of people from the EA community eventually rebranding, coming up with some other name for much of the same beliefs and coming back in public. And what's been interesting for me over the last year has been watching the emergence from a very similar space as EA, from sharing many of the same kind of rationalist roots, watching the effective accelerationism movement start to grow out of San Francisco.
If you're a consequentialist, like, I think it's worth thinking about EA giving birth to this monster.
Each movement disavows the other to a large extent, right? Most effective altruists don't think that effective accelerationists are handling these existential risks well, and effective accelerationists think EA people are thinking about the risks all wrong. But they both come out of and share a common canon around the same set of existential risks. And what's been interesting to me is we talked about the milquetoast version of EA, the very unobjectionable version, which is there are people who are suffering and dying and you should help them. The more objectionable version of EA, which mostly exists online and in a few small places in San Francisco, we should be clear.
Which is where most of EA is, though, to be clear. Well, that's where most of EA exists. I just want to make that clear.
But my point is, I want to be clear that there are many effective altruists who would disavow some of the types of things I'm going to describe, because I think that's important. But there was a significant subset of effective altruists who assembled and created this canon of beliefs around the existential risk of artificial general intelligence. And when a set of consequentialists with a slightly different view on what the end consequence of artificial general intelligence would be, two groups of consequentialists sharing a significantly overlapping canon came up with significantly, almost diametrically opposed views about how to handle a single risk. And that's stuck in my head.
Yeah, wow. I think that's a great point, Bennett. Here's my view of E-acc as it exists in San Francisco. I don't believe it actually exists. What I mean by that is a friend of mine is a 25-year-old woman and avid Twitter user. And for a few weeks, she had E-acc in her profile name. And I was very confused by this. So when I saw her, I asked her, why did you do that? And she's like, oh, those guys are funny. And I was like, do you know what the beliefs, what does it mean to be a E-acc? And she was like, I don't know, AI stuff. There is no central organism of there's no 501c3. They're not recruiting. They have no goals and no ability to achieve those goals. I don't who is it? Based Beth Bezos or something? And then there's that other guy. I can't even remember the other one. They're just yapping. They're just yappers. They're gonna be gone in a year or two. They're not even trying to do anything besides I don't know. Some of them probably have some small time grifts, but I think it's actually pretty obvious to most people who seriously follow the development of AI that these guys are they're just having fun posting. It might be that there are some negative consequences, but I'm not sure what they'd be.
Mark Andreessen, though. Are you suggesting Mark Andreessen isn't following the development of AI, or?
Yeah, but you know what? You know why he did it, right? He was just trying to be on the in-joke. I don't think he thought that E-acc is in any way a real movement or a future. Look, it might be. Look, maybe I'm totally wrong. It's just my impression talking to people who actually work on AI that they're oh, I don't know who those guys are. It seems all the people actually trying to develop AI and countermeasures for AI don't really know these people. Most of them seem to be just Twitter accounts, almost disembodied Twitter accounts. Whereas with EA or whatever, you could point to these are the guys. They go to events and they talk their book. You could say who you ought to email to discuss EA. Whereas if you wanted to talk about E-acc, who do you even talk to? I mean, I guess it's that Beth guy.
Someone get Beth on the phone.
Yeah, it just seems way less serious. I think it's stupid. Don't get me wrong.
We should probably define it for the audience.
Yeah, let's try.
Effective accelerationists are people who looked at the people who suggested that artificial general intelligence would be an existential risk to humanity and our collective survival and went, nuh-uh. Watch, we'll do it faster. And that's about it. And a bunch of the writers they love to reference are very bad people and stuff like that. But basically they were what if instead of being careful, we did the opposite? And so you're right that it's not as It's a less coherent philosophy. It is harder, as someone who loves philosophy, to do philosophical criticisms of EAC, because what are you looking at, 3 Substack posts?
I agree with you, but also when you mentioned, for instance, Mark Andreessen, right? Like, I had not read his techno-optimist piece, but that's very E-acc to me. Like, it is everything they're trying to express in their little cult in this way that a venture capitalist would do it. And I do think that he fully believes that stuff. I do think there's a lot of powerful people. While it's like we can laugh about how there's no cognitive, like we can't cohesively even understand what they're trying to do. A lot of people are just down who are in power.
Yeah. To put a finer point of it, I think what you're saying is that like to be an E-acc is simply to be like a kind of over the top cheerleader of techno capital. Yeah, it's like that plus some weird aesthetic. I think that's what makes an E-acc. And I think like, look, if you want to like expand the critique to that of like techno capital itself, I think that's fair game. And, you know, it's also just somewhat like beyond the scope of like what a few people, it's just so tough. Like, yeah, fuck Mark Andreessen, you know, like,
okay, that's all I really needed to hear. We're good.
Yeah, totally. How do I express what I'm saying? I would say in some ways, Cas, you have some common ground with E-acc people in so much as they were people who were negatively polarized by EA specifically. Like, I think the reason that E-acc came into existence is that like EA people were a little too neurotic about doomsaying about AI. And first, I think that just pissed them off, like from an aesthetics and tribalism point of view, and that like sort of congealed an aesthetic counter response. I think if you take, I think more Bennett's maybe wider critique that like the people in E-acc are roughly the people who would be like proponents of techno capital itself anyway, without the existence of the movement. I think that's fair and accurate too. But I will say, I think there's a lot of like, if you look at like E-acc, the aesthetic movement, I think there's like a shocking number of like 18-year-olds in there, you know, like compared to like, it's hard to divorce the, like, it's a like cultural phenomenon from like, this is a belief system shared by the rich and powerful. I think that's obviously true too. And yet somehow when you specifically invoke the words E-acc instead of techno-capital or whatever, like I think you're trying to say, or one is often trying to identify a slightly different group of people.
What you're talking about there was honestly one of my biggest difficulties the first time I started trying to look into E-acc, is because I went to the most trustworthy people and looked at like the people they've referenced as like their canonical pieces that like defined this space. I looked at the people they referenced and I'm like, wow, there's some really deeply troubling nihilistic beliefs. They're referencing some truly problematic belief systems and things like that as they assemble this philosophy. And then I'd go on Twitter and it was the dumbest people who had never once read a philosophy paper with E-acc in their bio. And so I didn't really know how to interpret it. I'm like, I don't know what I'm supposed to criticize. Am I supposed to criticize the idiot with E-acc in the Bible or the stupid philosophy paper that one person in the movement is citing?
Here's how I put it. Do you ever spend a lot of time on AIM, like as a teenager? Yeah, you know how like for like a good chunk of time, like the thing to do on AIM was to like set your away message to like a specific song or something?
Yeah.
Like likewise, I think like the way you become a E-acc is like you put E-acc in your profile on twitter.com and like you do it because like other people you think are kind of cool or attractive are doing it. And like, like I think that specific phenomenon will vanish not long from now. I think you're right to criticize like what some of the philosophical underpinnings of it seem to be. Like we have to extrapolate a little bit, which is to say, I think it's another way of saying like the only way out is through, right? Like the only way we can save humanity is by accelerating like the progress of technology. You know, I think you could spend a whole like 3 hours discussing that, but like the person you'd want to discuss that with is like not an E-acc person.
It's not Beth.
You know, it's like it's someone else.
Beth Jesus is a serious philosopher. We all agree.
He knows quantum, I heard.
He's going to put the AI in the quantum and we're all going to be in trouble.
The two names when I think of E-acc are Mark Andreessen and Gary Tan, actually.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And I get what you're saying in that it's not fully fleshed out and there's no 501c3 or whatever. But it's troubling to me that the people who most believe in this are those with a significant amount of power in one of the most important in one of the most important and wealthiest areas in America.
I'll give you that one. Yeah, I didn't like it when Gary Tan put E-acc in his profile. I didn't care about Mark because fuck Mark. But like Gary's a little more on the border, you know, like it seems like sometimes he can be convinced of reason and sometimes he can't be. And I felt like we lost that one. Like someone should have talked to him. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't have his phone number, but like, you know, maybe I should and maybe should have called him. Yeah, it's worrying, right? Like, because like to a lot of us, the movement is so like transparently trifling that when someone who is, I guess, important, like this decides to sign up, you're like, just like, what the hell is going on in here? And I agree. I don't have a good explanation for that. Besides that, I think these guys are trying to be 18 again. And this is what you do when you're 18. Like you
edgelord. You just think they're being edgelords.
I don't know. They're trying to have fun, I think.
No, I really do think you're onto something there, that they're like they want to be a provocative 18-year-old who still feels accepted and included in a group of other provocative 18-year-olds or emotionally whatever provocative 18-year-old. And it really kind of clicked for me when you were talking about the many people attracted to EACC because of the aesthetics, because of the people they see in it, because they want to go to the EAC meetup because the cute guy they were talking to in class was going to the EACC meetup or whatever. Is that like you saw that same dynamic in search and EA circles and stuff, where as it started to gain a bit of prominence, as there was a bit more money going into like EA type functions and stuff like that, there was a certain cultural attractiveness that led to a bunch of other people starting to identify themselves as long-termists or other kind of EA type words like that.
You might be right. I might be in the wrong circle. I guess what I'm trying to say, I don't know how to put this except indelicately. I was never enamored of the aesthetics of EA, and I'd never thought that their aesthetics or their social, like in an interpersonal sense, cachet was very strong. Take that how you want. I was actually sort of surprised that so many people were convinced to become EAs despite that. Usually you bootstrap a social movement with, how do I put it? Like a certain amount of charisma. Yes, exactly. And that EA succeeded despite that, I thought, was kind of cool. I think it's partly because some of the early speakers around the topic were actually pretty eloquent. You know, that you would talk to them for a while and you would actually find yourself sort of convinced. I think it was my impression. Like the late Peter Eckersley, for instance, right? Like, I guess he did have charisma, you know, in his own way. He was like, he did a lot of good. He got around town. People liked his work. I think that's how they did it, you know, somehow. Do you guys want to join E-acc? Like, we could do it right now. Like, it would be really easy. Yeah, we just log in.
I'm good.
The day this episode comes out, we all have E-acc in our Twitter usernames.
Yeah. It would be fun, right? And then we could go to the meetups. I kind of want to.
I think you can already go to the meetups.
Yeah, I don't know. You have to be invited, right? Like, I don't know when they're happening.
I can't. There's no effective accelerationism meetups in Western Illinois, I promise you.
You can start it. You can start it, Bennett.
Yeah.
Now's your chance.
It could be fun. Like, okay, I think that's part of the appeal too, is that the barrier to entry is low. Like, if you want to have an E-acc meetup, like any party you throw at your house could be, you just have to say that it is. And there's something to that. Like, I think it's akin to how crypto caught on. You know what I mean? Like, if we want to call back to your earlier, the bulk of the work of this podcast, like, there's something about
this argument at all.
I'm not gonna. No, this is I'm not trying to defend any of these.
Here's my issue, that you're gonna say it's like crypto in this sense, and I'm already like, yes, and because of the way that crypto is, it's so pernicious now. Like, it is it's everywhere. So you're saying like E-acc is kind of like throwaway garbage, but that's precisely why I'm scared.
Well, with crypto you can make money. I think that's what made it have staying power. I think I'm just trying to describe like a recruitment method here. You know what I mean? Like the crypto was good at making it seem like anyone could get on board, right? Like,
but that's yes, I agree.
I think that's what's pernicious about it. I think my belief is that it will fade without some sort of central motivating like ideology. Like I don't
giving them too many ideas, Vincent. We're giving them way too many. They're just going to run with this. You know they're going to run with this.
What's actually especially interesting is when you said you were just comparing recruiting techniques, all I kept thinking was, it's funny. Both crypto and EA worked by marketing a sense of like inclusion in some grand idea that most people didn't understand and targeting primarily a group of like disaffected antisocial weirdos.
Shit, you're convincing me, actually. Yeah, maybe I should rate that higher.
You started that. You made that comparison, not me.
Well, I think of E-acc as still like super local. Like, I don't think it's really broken.
Oh, sure. I was thinking more EA. E-acc's a dozen weirdos.
Yeah, no, totally.
100 Klingon.
Yeah. I don't know. If EA is still around from 10 years from now, I'm not going to be that upset. I'm okay with that. E-acc, if it's around 10 years from now, I'll be a little upset. Like, I think that's what I'm saying.
If I remember the name Beth Bezos 10 years from now, that's it. I'm done for.
I got bad news for you, bud. You're gonna...
After I edit this podcast,
you said it too many times.
It'll never leave my brain.
You're going to hear it like 50 more times. Like, you're fucked, man. That's it for you. Yeah, I hate it when I realize I'm about to remember something stupid for the rest of my life. Like, it feels like a curse. Like, how come we can't just close our mind? Like, you can close your eyes, but you can't close the thing in you that remembers stuff. Like, it's...
This is why we need Neuralink.
Oh, shit, you're right. Wait, can they do that?
Eventually.
You can just ask Elon if you can...
I mean, like, that would genuinely be kind of cool. Like...
Eternal
I don't know
Sunshine?
that I'd be... I don't think it'd be in the first million people to sign up, but I might be in the second million people to sign up.
You're stoked for Eternal Sunshine. You want to lose your memory. Dude, just get old enough. Get old enough. You're fine.
I've got brain damage. The memory loss is coming whether I like it or not.
Look, I'm a drugs guy, like I think of Neuralink as just like the next frontier of like recreational drugs, Like
I think that's a therapeutic endpoint that's a little bit harder to get FDA approval for.
Yeah, I mean, we're just gonna mod chip your Neuralink or what, like there'll be like black market Neuralinks. You'd be like, hey man, you download the newest mod pack, like
what I hate is you're not wrong. Like if it exists and is popular, that will absolutely follow.
I think it's kind of sad. We'll probably die before that comes around. I was kind of looking forward to that.
This episode's gonna get canceled because Elon we're giving away his business model.
Oh,
Elon was actually the second person to get a Neuralink just to get off ketamine. Yeah. Definitely cutting that line. That's not making the episode.
Yeah, totally. Get rid of that. I didn't know that Elon owned this podcast. Was what I was gonna say. I was like, whoa, like Elon can cancel this pod? Like,
Elon's gonna buy Spotify and turn it into xx.com.
At this point, like, who knows what he'll do? The magic of Elon. He could do any action at any time. He's the only one of us that's free. The rest of us are just stuck in the matrix of being predictable humans. But Elon.
The rest of us have to worry about getting checks and keeping jobs.
Yeah,
kids are free, guys. Kids are free, as Elon says. Kids are free.
No, he pays. Right?
He says they're free. Kids are free.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he's legally obligated to pay thousands of dollars a month.
Don't talk about the horse, guys. We're not talking about the horse.
He definitely paid one of his ex-employees to have one of his children, right?
Well, he's definitely paying at least some of his ex-wives and mothers of his children child support, right?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully they all just get to live in a compound together or something.
Hopefully
do you ever think they'll be
I don't think they all like each other that well.
There should be a reality show with like all of Elon's children, like 18 years from now or something. Like,
18 on 18 or something. Yeah, it'll be all of them. It'll be all 18 children. Yeah, we already did this
with like the Mormons, Like, I feel like they should do it with just Elon.
Yeah.
That'd be sick.
We can let May Musk host it.
Oh, God. Thanks for that. All right, Vincent, as we close this episode out, is there anything you would like to, tell anyone about? Is there anything you're working on, or, any stuff you want to talk about?
Should I plug the Honest Charlie thing?
Sure.
Is that what you're saying? Hey, if you guys want to see a fun documentary with a mayoral candidate in San Francisco who's been banned from almost every bar in a particular neighborhood, you should go to my Twitter page. It's on there. My Twitter handle is FULLIGIN. This is a terrible plug.
The video will also be linked in the description of this video on YouTube.
Oh, cool. You can do that. Yeah. It's a good video, I think. I mean, I made it, so yeah.
I watched it. I gave it a like.
You don't even live here.
I don't even live in San Francisco. I can't even vote.